Hi, this is Paris. I saw on the Dr. Oz show this morning that they were talking about genetically modified foods and wanted to add my 2 cents to that conversation. I thought Dr. Oz did a pretty good job of letting people on both sides speak, even though they had that weird thing where they won't both be on the stage at the same time because they would lend legitimacy to the other side. I thought that was kind of extreme, but people these days do have such strong feelings about things. Anyway, about the genetically modified foods and the genetic modification of things in general, there are certainly times when it's beneficial. I don't think it makes any sense to have a hardline approach and say absolutely not, never, for any reason. The genetically modified wheat that has been developed to grow in Africa in drought-stricken regions so that the people, the farmers there, even with a very limited amount of rainfall, can actually grow wheat, people can have food. I'm sure the people there think that was a good thing that the food was genetically modified because they actually had food and they wouldn't otherwise. So if you had to choose between no food and genetically modified food, you'll pick the genetically modified. In this country, in the United States, we don't have that problem. We have an abundance of food. The supermarkets, lines end to end, and a new store that I visited that it's so far to walk from one end to the other, I swear you can start to see the curve of the earth. Anyway, we don't have the issue of not having any food. For us, it's a question of what's the best food to have. And as I talked about on the show, a lot of foods now have genetically modified ingredients in them because the main staple crops, like corn and the sugar beets and other things, have been genetically modified. And then those foods in turn are put into many, many different processed foods. If you're eating whole foods and you go just to the produce department, you can much more easily stay away from the genetically modified things. But if you want a cookie or potato chips or something that somebody has somewhat prepared for you, processed and put in a package that you can conveniently eat, then you're probably going to have the genetically modified food in it. Now, when it comes to the safety of the genetic modifications, I think you have to look at who's profiting from having made those modifications. If the profit is to the customer, if it makes the food healthier, for example, they have a peanut butter that they've genetically modified so that by eating it, it's sort of cholesterol lowering, even though the peanut butter itself is high in fats. This will supposedly lower cholesterol by eating it. They've taken a gene that has the effect of producing a chemical or a protein that will result in your cholesterol going down. It's sort of like that smart butter, that sort of stuff. The stuff that's not margarine, it's not butter, but if you eat that, it's supposed to actually lower your cholesterol. So there are modifications that will benefit the consumer. There are modifications that are environmental. If you can make a tomato plant that's resistant to certain insects, well then you aren't going to have to spray the plants with certain pesticides. Of course, if the genetic modification is causing the plant to produce a pesticide that's going to harm people, then it wasn't a good trade-off. So you have to weigh that out. But there are those modifications that are trying to help the end user, the consumer. Then there are the modifications that help out the companies, that the farmers and the companies that deal with the food production. So you have modifications to make fruit that won't bruise as easily because people in the store don't, you want the perfect fruit, you want the perfect apple without any imperfection. And so they modify the fruit so that it's tougher, whatever, however they do it, so that it doesn't bruise as easily. Well, that's primarily their benefit. They'll be able to get more of the fruit down to the supermarket without the bruises. They'll be more likely to sell it and not have to throw it away. It's a direct benefit to them, secondarily to you because it would lower the cost if they can sell more of the apples that they pick and don't have to throw as many away at the end. But the concern with any of the modifications is unintended consequences. For example, I was just talking about the bruising situation with the fruit. It turns out they've discovered with tomatoes that the reason tomatoes aren't that sweet anymore, have lost that flavor that they used to have. If you read about people just eating tomatoes like they would eat an apple, and people don't do that as much anymore. It turned out, I don't remember exactly when this was before the big genetic modification that you do in microbiology. It was more a breeding for a particular thing. It was, I think, back in the 50s or 60s that the tomatoes, they found that the tomatoes that were that full red color sold best. and so they bred them so that they would get that type of tomato. The side effect of it is that those tomatoes aren't as sweet. And so you have all these wonderful looking tomatoes at the supermarket, but they don't, in other words, if they're producing the pigmentation and what's required to make a tomato bright red, uniformly red, beautiful looking, it's not going to be producing what's needed to make the tomato sweet and delicious. So you can have it look good, you can have it taste good. If people were aware of this, then you wouldn't care what the tomato looked like. You knew that the mottled green red one would be the delicious one and you would buy that, but people aren't educated about it. All they know is it looks really nice in the supermarket. That's what I'm going to buy, this mottled green red one. Ooh, that looks weird to me. So you don't buy it even though it's 10 times more delicious than your perfect red one. And of course, these modifications have been going on long before we could go in and remove genes from one particular plant and put them into the DNA strands of another. In fact, it goes all the way back 10,000 years to the beginning of agriculture, that if you had a plot of land and you wanted to grow bigger, healthier berry bushes or whatever it was, after a couple of years you would look at your 2, 3, 4 biggest bushes and you might choose to pollinate them manually with each other. You would get the pollen from one and make sure that you're pollinating the biggest bushes with the other big bushes, and the seeds that come from that you plant, and it turns out these are bigger bushes than any in your original plot. And so you can manipulate things that way, and that's how we got all the different varieties of dogs from the original wolf, that it's been bred into the tiny little ones and the giant ones, and with all their different abilities. That's all human manipulation of the genes of the dog, not by going in though and manipulating them with tools and microscopes, but doing it through breeding. And so that's been done with plants. Of course, that's how we have a lot of different varieties of plants. And going further back, the plants themselves have had to do this because the DNA that produces a particular type of plant, a particular type of animal, there is no perfect DNA. There is no perfect plant, no perfect animal. There may be a perfect plant for a given environment. In this location, at this time, under these conditions, this is the perfect plant. This is the perfect animal. But the conditions don't stay the same very long on Earth, as the dinosaurs would be glad to tell you if they hadn't all been wiped out by changing environmental conditions. They couldn't adapt fast enough through the changes, the mutations that naturally occur in their DNA for them to continue to exist through the very rapid environmental changes. At least that's our best guess as to what happened. So plants have always been modifying their own DNA. They have to respond to existing conditions. If the environment gets drier, then you have to have changes in the plant that make for longer roots, make for a more waxy coating on the outside to conserve the moisture, and those types of changes the plants have to change. I'm sort of informally conducting an experiment in my yard here in central Texas. We've had bad drought now for a few years, and it looks like this may be the way the environment's going to be going. And unless you pour several $100s worth of water a month on your yard to keep your lawn, the lawn gets pretty ratty looking. It'll go a long period, a month or more, with that 100-degree temperature, no rain, and you get the brown spots and patches where nothing will grow, and then there's the area under the trees that's different because it's in the shade. So it's quite a range of ecosystems, and one type of grass doesn't do well in the shade and also in the sun usually. So now this is also partly just an excuse for my laziness of not wanting to go out and work in the yard. But I mow the lawn, but I let grow what wants to grow. And so in the different places in the yard, with the northern exposure, the southern exposure, which suffers from more heat, I have different things growing. It's all sort of grass related, but it's as near as I can tell, it's evolving and it's working itself out as to what's best suited for each microenvironment, and also for the macro environment of what's going on in terms of the amount of rain and the temperatures, the fact that the winters seem to be getting warmer and the summers just bake on and on and on. So natural mutations, what we might call genetic modifications, are occurring ongoing in all plants, all animals, ourselves as well. And whether the change, the natural change that would occur in corn as the place where it's being grown gets drier and hotter, whether some of those genetic modifications that occur just naturally could have a detrimental effect on animals that eat the corn. That could happen. We have no way of knowing. We don't control for that. We don't test for that. You plant the corn, you harvest it, and you eat it, and whatever's changed since the last generation of corn that grew there, you just deal with it. And I really think there needs to be a lot of testing done on the genetic modifications, especially because of the unintended consequences that can happen, but also because it's in the financial interest of some people to make these modifications, and that tends to lead to cutting corners, and sometimes at the expense of the consumer, of the person who's going to eat the food. And that's where the highest priority of safety needs to be. Of course, talking about fail-safe, lots of science fiction stories about genetic experiments gone wrong. So that's what people are afraid of, and people are right to be afraid. Everyone's going to have a different opinion about this, whether they think the scientists and the FDA are responsible enough to test it thoroughly before allowing it out in the public, or whether they want to be really paranoid and not have any of it at all. What I do think, though, is you should know which foods you're consuming have genetically modified organisms, well, are genetically modified. And so the labeling requirement just makes so much sense for the food companies to have to label their foods so that people have that information. It is a safety issue, and so people certainly have the right to decide whether this is something they themselves want to eat, whether they want to feed it to their children, and they should know whether or not the foods that they're eating contain it. Another thing that a lot of people are nervous about, cell phone usage, the fact that it's sending out radio waves to the tower and you're holding it right up against your head. The tests have all shown there's no correlation between brain cancer and having the phone there. But, and I don't believe there's a correlation. However, when I'm going to buy a new phone for myself, I check the SAR rating, the radiation rating. That's all the phones are required to be tested and to report how much radiation they put out. And there's a number. The limit is 1.65. I forgot, something per something. And the lower it is, the less radiation it gives out. And every time I've had to get a new phone, every 2-3 years, I've always checked that. And if I'm deciding between two phones, I'll pick the one with the lower radiation rating, even though I don't think the radiation is harming me. If you have the choice, whether it's a logical thing or not, sometimes it just makes you feel better to err on the side of safety. So, in conclusion, genetically modified foods are not necessarily a bad thing. The modifications have been going on ever since there have been plants, and are going on now, and will continue to go on whether or not we have anything to do with it. So it's a matter of thorough testing to make sure that there aren't those unintended consequences, that when we make the change to improve this, that there won't be some adverse effect, whether in ourselves or maybe even the animals that we feed that plant matter to. The other thing is you really have to keep an eye on the companies that stand to make money by doing certain modifications. That's actually in the best interest of the consumer. You don't want the tomato farmers to go and take the nicotine from the tobacco plant and stick some of that DNA in there, so suddenly everybody becomes tomato fiends and can't get enough of them. Or what more realistically, they might try to increase the amount of sugar in tomatoes by going in and making modifications and making them very sweet like apples. Do you want that or do you not want that? If people ate more tomatoes because they were sweeter, it seems as though you're manipulating the people with sugar. But if people ate more tomatoes, they would probably be healthier because of the lycopene and the other things in the tomatoes. So it's a debate you have to have, but I don't think you can just say that genetically modified foods are bad and that's the end of it. So it's a discussion that needs to continue. Thank you for listening.